Okay, let's look at number 24. So the conclusion is properly drawn if which of the following is assumed. That means we're looking for an assumption. Specifically, we're looking for a sufficient assumption, something that, if true, is going to prove the conclusion in this argument. So this is actually a fairly simple question, even though it's right at the end of the section. It's actually quite simple, quite a predictable question. So let's go ahead and look at the argument. So the filmmaker says, a lot of people think that independent films have more integrity as works of art than movies that are made by major studios, since independent films are less conventional than major studio films. However, and here's really, like many LSAT questions, here's really where the real argument starts. The whole first half of the paragraph, that was what many people think. That was what some other people think, right? But my argument, the person writing this paragraph, their argument really just starts here halfway through. So there's a lot of questions like this where it starts off saying, well, a lot of people think this or that, but here's my argument. So this is really the important part, is that my argument is that, however, just like major studios, independent filmmakers also need to make profits on their movies, which affects the artistic decisions that they make in making their independent films. So in other words, to sum up this sentence that we just read, independent filmmakers need to make profit affects the artistic decisions in their films. The conclusion says, therefore, thus, because of that, the conclusion is that most independent films don't have absolute integrity as works of art. So very simple, we have support and conclusion. Support is that independent filmmakers are affected by profits. Their artistic decisions are affected by the need to make profits. And the conclusion is that, therefore, since that's true, those films don't have absolute integrity as works of art. So as with any assumption question, we are assuming if support, then conclusion. We are assuming that this support proves this conclusion. We're assuming that if it is true that their profit needs affects their artistic decision making, we're assuming that if that's true, then that must mean that their films don't actually have absolute integrity as works of art. Very simple. We were given one piece of support and we were given a conclusion, and the assumption is if support, then conclusion. So let's look for that in the answer choices. Let's look for an answer that basically says that any time you have the need to make profit affecting your artistic decisions, then that means your movie is not going to have absolute integrity. So let's look for that. A is a textbook mistake. A says that a creation does have absolute integrity as a work of art if the artistic decisions made in its creation were not affected by the need to make profits. So this is a classic error where we are looking for if support, then conclusion. And A says if not support, then not conclusion, right? The assumption to prove this argument is if the need for profit did affect the artistic decisions, then it does not have integrity. A is saying if it was not affected by the need to make profits, then it does have absolute integrity. So that's the opposite, right? We're looking for if X, then Y. A says if not X, then not Y. And if you're an experienced LSAT taker, you know that those two things are very much not the same thing at all. Just because if X, then Y doesn't mean if not X, then not Y. And for that matter, just because if not X, then not Y doesn't mean if yes X, then yes Y, right? So A is not going to help us prove the conclusion, because A is saying that if a film was totally unaffected by the need to make profits, then we would know for sure that it does have absolute integrity. So that would help us prove that some other film does have absolute integrity if that film was unaffected by the need to make profits in its artistic decision making, right? But that doesn't apply to this argument. This argument is trying to prove that independent films, because they are affected by the need to make profit, we're trying to prove that therefore they don't have absolute integrity, right? So A is not going to help us prove that, right? This is a sufficient, necessary, conditional logic error. Again, if you're experienced at the LSAT, if you've seen a bunch of my videos, you know what that means. But A is basically a classic textbook flaw. You're going to see this on a lot of assumption questions where you're looking for if support, then conclusion. A is basically saying if not support, then not conclusion. That's wrong. That's not what you're looking for, so A is wrong. B is exactly what we're looking for. Very simple. B says if support, then conclusion. If any of the artistic decisions made in creating something were affected by the need to make profits, in other words, if the support of this argument is true, then the conclusion of the argument is true. Then that creation must not have absolute integrity as a work of art. Bingo, exactly what we're looking for. Now, some people see this and they say, but isn't it written in too extreme of a way, right? Because the conclusion of our argument just says most independent films don't have absolute integrity as works of art, right? We're just trying to prove that most independent films don't have absolute integrity as works of art. B seemingly goes a little too far because B says if any artistic decision made in creating something were affected by the need to make profits, then that creation always 100% of the time must not ever have absolute integrity as a work of art. So B seems to prove that it'll never have integrity, whereas the conclusion is just trying to prove that most independent films don't have integrity. So doesn't B go too far is a question that I get sometimes. And here's two answers to that question. First of all, if B went too far, it actually wouldn't matter. It'd be okay because we're looking for a sufficient assumption on this question, right? The question says the conclusion is properly drawn if which of the following is assumed. That means it's okay if it goes too far. As long as it proves the conclusion, that's fine. If it proves even more than the conclusion, then that's even better because then it's definitely proving the conclusion. If the conclusion is saying most films don't have integrity and we go even further, we say all films don't have integrity, that's even better because then that certainly proves that most films don't have integrity if all films don't have integrity. So therefore, even if it were too extreme, because this is a sufficient assumption question as opposed to a necessary assumption question, you might want to see my tutorial videos on that if this is seeming a little unclear. But because that's the case, then it's okay if B goes too far. That's answer number one. Answer number two is in addition to that, it happens to be that B doesn't even go too far. It just kind of seems like it does sometimes to some people. The reason it doesn't go too far is because even though the conclusion of the argument says most independent films don't have absolute integrity as works of art, if we rewind to the supporting sentence, let's read that whole part of the argument again. What does it say? It says all independent filmmakers need to make profits, which affects the artistic decisions made in creating most independent films. And therefore, most independent films don't have absolute integrity. So we're going from most to most, right? So therefore, B would not prove that all independent films don't have absolute integrity. It would just prove that most of them don't, because it's the most that they told us about in the supporting sentence that the profit affects the decision making, right? So in those most, in that majority, according to B, that entire majority of independent films where the need to make profit affects the decision making, in that entire majority, all of those films won't have absolute integrity as works of art, which is still going to be most independent films. So therefore, since the support and the conclusion both say most, B says all, right? B says all of those most that are in the support are going to be true in the conclusion as well. So anyway, none of that is that important because, again, the simpler way to see why B is not too extreme or why it's not wrong for that reason is because even if it were too extreme, it wouldn't matter because we're looking for sufficient assumption. So anyway, hopefully this makes sense. B is very clearly the simple answer that we're looking for. C does not have anything to do with our argument, meaning it does mention integrity and creations of individuals, right, having more integrity than creations of groups, but that's not the distinction that's relevant to our argument. Our argument is saying that because independent films have the need to make profits and because that affects their decision making, therefore they do not have integrity as works of art. C is making some kind of tangential statement, which is saying regardless of the profit stuff, it's just saying that creations of individuals tend to have more integrity than creations of groups. But that does not help us prove our conclusion that independent films do not have integrity, right? C does not prove that. C just says, well, when you compare individuals to groups, one has more integrity than the other, but that simply does not prove our conclusion that most independent films have no absolute integrity as works of art, so therefore I think this is clearly not going to be the answer. D is not going to help us because D doesn't pertain to the actual argument. D has to do with the first half of the paragraph, right? The first half of the paragraph is what other people are arguing, which is that independent films have more integrity because they're less conventional. D kind of ruins that argument. D says, no, the unconventionality of something has no bearing on whether it has integrity as a work of art or not. So D does ruin the many people's argument. The many people that are quoted in the first sentence, it ruins their argument. But it doesn't prove the filmmaker's argument in the second half of the paragraph, right? So that's not the same thing. The filmmaker is responding to that argument, but that doesn't mean that destroying that argument proves the filmmaker's argument, right? So we're trying to prove the filmmaker's conclusion, which is that independent films mostly have no integrity. D doesn't prove that. D just says, well, the unconventionality has no bearing. It doesn't tell us whether it has integrity or not. So according to D, I don't know whether it has integrity or not. I sort of have to go back to square one, right? So D just tells me that I don't know whether it has integrity or not. But it doesn't prove the filmmaker's conclusion, which is that they do not have integrity most of the time. So that's why D is not going to prove our conclusion. E is sort of trying to trick you, but it doesn't really make sense. E is saying that a creation is not going to have integrity as a work of art unless, so far this could be the right answer, right? Because we want to prove that these creations in the paragraph don't have integrity as a work of art. So E is saying, yeah, there's no way that it can have integrity as a work of art unless what? Unless the artistic decisions made in creating it were unaffected by, so far this could still be the right answer if it said we're unaffected by the need to make profit. That would be exactly what we're looking for, but it doesn't say that. It says, unless the decisions made in creating it were unaffected by views about what is conventional. I don't even know what that means, right? That's kind of mixing things from the top of the paragraph with the bottom of the paragraph, right? The first half of the paragraph is talking about conventional versus not conventional. The second half of the paragraph, which is the part that we care about, because that's the argument, was talking about artistic decisions made in creating films and what affects them, right? But really, we're taking one thing from one context and we're applying it to another context. We're jumbling it together. We're just taking a bunch of words from the paragraph and jumbling it together in a way that doesn't really make sense and certainly doesn't answer the question, right? We're trying to prove that since the artistic decisions were affected by the profit motive, they must not have integrity. Now, I don't know whether the artistic decisions were affected by views about what's conventional or not, and therefore E wouldn't tell me anything about independent films because I don't know whether this thing written in E, I don't know whether that's true of independent films or whether it's not true. The only thing I know about most independent films, according to this paragraph, is that the decision-making was affected by the need to make profit. Whether it was affected by the views about what's conventional or not conventional, that I don't even know. So therefore, E's not going to help me prove this conclusion. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.